So, the first time I heard Peter Cusack was during a French radio program called Electromania. During this program, which was broadcast for several years and which, alas, does not exist any longer, it was possible to listen to heterogeneous kinds of electronic music, from Pierre Schaeffer to Anti-Set, Matmos, Square Pusher, or Plastic Man. One day, or more precisely, one night, the program was broadcast at midnight. In June 2013, I listened to a sort of active, overactive, or more accurately, radioactive piece that sharply contrasted with the rest of the program. It was a piece of Cusack entitled Radiometer Copaci, an excerpt from Sounds from Dangerous Places. This album, which is a part of a more global project, including lectures, radio programs, gallery installations, publications, and CDs, was recorded in Chernobyl in May 2006 and July 2007, if I am correct. Sometimes in the dangerous exclusion zone, that is to say the core of the zone of the catastrophic nuclear accident of 1986. Cusack calls this kind of music sonic journalism. This way of capturing and rendering the real compels us to think about the operation of recording itself. Peter Cusack is a field recordist, sound artist and musician with a long interest in the sound environment. He's based, and I checked yesterday, in Berlin and London. In 1998, he initiated the Favorite Sounds project that explores what people find positive about the soundscapes of the places where they live. The project has been carried out in London, Beijing, Chicago, Prague, Birmingham, Aral Sea, maybe it's not a good pronunciation, and Berlin. Cusack is a research fellow and a member of CriSAP, Creative Research into Sound Arts Practice at the University of the Arts, London. During 2011 and 2012, he was a DAAD artist in residence in Berlin. He also initiated Berlin Sonic Places that considers the relationship between soundscapes and urban development. Amongst his several albums, I call special notice to Your Favorite London Sounds, Baikal Ice, Favorite Beijing Sounds, Sound from Dangerous Places, and Favorite Berlin Sounds. Sounds. What sounds? What sort of sounds? What is the relation between sounds, music, and the environment? In the booklet accompanying an album called Interpreting the Soundscape that Cusack curated in 2006, he considered the incontestable multiplicity of the tracks and wrote, I quote, although many of the pieces have starting points and connections beyond music, the end results show a high degree of musicality. And he concluded, I quote again, maybe there is an inherent tendency in all of us to search for the aesthetic in our everyday hearing. I do have this tendency as a listener, and it's one of the reasons for which the presence of Peter Cusack tonight in Madison delights me. He has a marvelous capacity to show us that even when ecological disasters are at stake, realism is not a grey wall, a dead end, but a sort of passage toward an unheard perception of the world. Thanks, Peter, for making resonate tonight the soundscape of your thoughts.
So this today will be one of the results. As Frederick also said, I've had a long interest in the sounds of the environment, and that's split usually for me into two very long projects. One is to do with the sounds of the cities in the Western world where we live, and I'm interested in how people interact with everyday soundscapes. And the other is called Sounds from Dangerous Places, and it's aimed at trying to understand environments of disaster or catastrophe or of environmental disaster through listening to the sounds that are to be heard there. And that's what I'll speak about tonight. That project began in 2004 when I visited for the first time oil fields. I had no intention of visiting oil fields, but I had gone to Baku, which is the capital city of Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea, as a holiday. And it turns out that Baku is the centre of the Caspian oil fields, or the Caspian oil fields in Azerbaijan. And so they are impossible to avoid if you do go there. So I went to visit, and they're completely open. It's not difficult to just walk around. I found they were visually and sonically stunning places from an aesthetic point of view. They hum and squeak, or rather the pumps that pump out the oil from below the ground all hum and squeak, and there are many of them operating at the same time, so they all hum and squeak at different pitches and at different cycles. So the whole soundscape in an oil field there is very musical. It's also visually stunning because those are the oldest oil fields in the world. They've been there since the 1860s, 70s. They're also the main Soviet oil fields for quite a number of years at the beginning of the century. So a lot of the technology there is old and disused, and it's decayed into sculptural heaps which are visually stunning, particularly against yellow earth and blue sky, which is what the original landscape is. So that was pretty impressive from an aesthetic point of view. And that's where the project started, because after being stunned for a while by what it sounded like and what it looked like, I began to notice other things, such as the fact that there were people actually living in these places. One of the visual stunning features is that the oil pollutes the whole landscape, but pools of oil are very reflective, so they reflect all the pumps and the technologies around in them, making them more visually impressive. But on the other hand, they are very polluted. But people were living there, people were fishing there, it's by the sea. There were men with lines out catching fish. There were even cows grazing amongst these black pools on the few blades of grass that there are, also covered in oil. So I asked who these people were, why were they living there, and I was told they were marginalised people. They weren't able, they were so badly treated they weren't able to find anywhere else to live, which immediately opened the whole idea of the social and the cultural and the economic side of these places, which up till then I had ignored in favour of the aesthetic. In other words, I was presented with a big dichotomy between what the places were like for the people who lived there and their economic and political impact on the region and on the world, and their aesthetic, which was, as I say, from my point of view, impressive and in fact stunning. So that's where the project started. The dichotomy that there often is between what places look like and sound like, and how they are in reality for the people that live there, and in their impact in the local area and for the world. So after that experience, I looked around for other places which might show similar layers of interest, and of course there are many. There are big ones and small ones in every country all over the world. Another big one was Chernobyl. Chernobyl up until Fukushima in 2013, or was it 11? I can't remember, it was 11, was the worst nuclear accident. Happened in 1986. So I decided I'd visit that and see it, but also hear it. And that's what I'd like to speak about mostly now. Maybe the best way to do this, the reason I choose Chernobyl often for talks is because almost everybody knows about it to a certain extent. It's very well documented. We all have images, whether they be correct or incorrect, realistic or unrealistic is another issue, but we all have some knowledge of Chernobyl. It's often in the media, or it has been. There are TV programs, newspaper articles, there's lots of information on the internet. Most of this is visual or text, either spoken text or written. So there is a level amongst many people of familiarity with Chernobyl, and that's why one reason I was interested, because out of that, it's very rare that we actually hear what the place sounds like. We have visual images from it, we have lots of discussion or written text, but as to what it sounds like, just to be there and stop talking and listen, that is almost never spoken of or indeed presented in the media. But that's what interests me. The question is, given that we know actually quite a lot about Chernobyl, does listening to it give us anything new or different from what we get from the visual images or from the text, the language? So that's what I'd like to discuss mostly. I thought I would show some visual images just to remind us of what it looks like, and then as a separate issue play recordings that were made there, so that we don't see them together, but memory and imagination play a role in how the sounds and the images are linked. Try and set that up. Maybe lights dim. Yeah, it's dim. These are some shots from the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which I visited in 2006 and 2007, so 2 visits. The exclusion zone is a 30-kilometre diameter area with the exploded reactor roughly in the centre. And still today you need permission to enter it. The permission is actually quite easy to get. It merely requires you paying the fee. They're very keen to use this as a way of making a bit of money. And in fact, the exclusion zone is now on the tourist map. You can get coach trips from Kiev to see this for a day. The radioactivity after this amount of time has now died right down, and most of it is back to normal levels. The reason Chernobyl exists, or the reason the nuclear reactors exist, of course, was to create electricity, and these are just some of the sites to do with electricity. It's mostly a forested area, and that's what the forest looks like. This is one of the few remaining hotspots. When I say the reactivity has died down, that's largely true, but there are a few hotspots that remain, which took more than their fair share of the fallout that came down. This is one of them. Underneath those mounds is a buried village. The village is called Kazakhstan, and one of the ways that the place was cleaned up was by burying some of the most radioactively polluted buildings or topsoil, which was scraped off and then buried further down. Anywhere where there was fallout or bad fallout was scraped up and buried. And the village is under that. There were no people living in it at the time. This village is only 1 kilometre from the reactor site, and during the building of the reactors, everybody had been evacuated out. So the village remained, but it was empty of its residents. So nobody was injured, killed, or radiated there, but the village itself was. This is more pylons. In the background you see the building with the chimney. That's the exploded reactor. This is 2006, so 20 years later. That's it has a layer of concrete over it to stop any more radioactivity coming out. That's what they did as the first operation to get the explosion under control. This is the nearest town to the exploded reactor is Pripyat. It was a newly built town where all the workers at the nuclear site, plus their families, lived, about 50,000 people. That town was evacuated in 5 days after the accident happened, and it remains completely abandoned. This is one of the most iconic iconic photographs from Chernobyl. It's the Ferris wheel in a children's playground from Pripyat. In fact, that was never used. It was going to be opened on the 1st of May, the 1st of May celebrations in the Soviet Union. A very big event in the year. But the accident happened on the 26th of April, 5 days before, so in fact that was never used. But it's still there, rusting away and blowing in the wind. This is what Pripyat looks like, or looked like 10 years ago, but I doubt it to be too much different now. And if you get permission to go in, then you're again free to walk around. You can climb to the top of the tower blocks if you wish. Some of them aren't very safe any longer, but some of them are still fine. And as you can see, the forest is growing back right through the middle of it all. That's an old swimming pool, no longer used. This is the music room in the kindergarten. There were 6 kindergartens there, and again you can explore the abandoned and decaying buildings. That's a mural on the same kindergarten. These places were evacuated very quickly, so much stuff was just abandoned and left there. But anything valuable has since been looted 100 times over. So what's still there is this kind of thing. Books fallen off the shelves onto the floor. That device in the centre of the photo there is a radiometer, a kind of Geiger counter, a way of measuring radioactivity. Maybe you can't see it, but the reading on the screen there is, I believe, 12. Yeah, 12, which is a very low reading. Normal background is about 20. So even now, a kilometre away from the explosion site, inside the buildings, the radioactivity is very low. But these are just children's books lying on the floor. It's not totally abandoned. There is a laundry in this town. That's the only building which is still used. And it's for washing clothes used by the nuclear workers. If they get a little bit contaminated, this laundry is specialised for dealing with very low-level radio contamination in the washing. The woman you see there has been working there ever since the accident. She is very happy with her job, and there's no complaints. That's her. This is a bar. This is now Chernobyl town. Chernobyl town, where the name comes from, is actually 13 kilometres from the site, reactor site, and it's the administrative centre of the exclusion zone. Exclusion zone implies that nobody is there. That's not in fact the case. In fact, I was very surprised to find that many people still live there. About 15,000 people still work there. It's semi-militarised, and people like to wear that kind of clothing. And when you have that many people, you need bars, restaurants, accommodation, roads, forestry, a whole infrastructure of normal town life, and that's an example. This is Chernobyl town. That is an old synagogue. It used to be, this is before Stalin and before the Second World War. It was a Jewish town, but and that's the sarcophagus, so-called. That's the concrete structure built over the exploded reactor. Today they are replacing it. This was a construction that had to be made very quickly. Nobody, of course, had to deal with such an accident, and an architect in Leningrad, I believe, came up with this idea very quickly, and they built it. And it has worked for the most part, but it's old, it's cracking, and it needs to be replaced, so they're building an even bigger new structure over the top, which in fact almost complete. So this photograph is now out of date. The exclusion zone, there are 50,000 workers in Pripyat, but actually the majority of the people in the exclusion zone were villagers, small farmers, foresters, whose families had lived in these villages for many generations, completely separate from the nuclear industry. These were the local people, and these are some of the old villages. Some people still live there. Some claim never to have left. When the army came to evacuate them forcibly, they went and hid in the forest, they say, and came back when the army had gone. Others of them were evacuated, but returned a couple of years later because they were unhappy with life elsewhere. And in the end, the Ukrainian government has let them stay. And today they are given a pension. Most of these are now very elderly people, 70 upwards. That's an old Second World War memorial in one of the villages. The people here made a lot of comparison between the Second World War and Chernobyl. On both, they suffered an invading force in their eyes. At Chernobyl, it was the Soviet authorities who came to move them out. In the Second World War, it was the invasion of the German army. They saw those as being similar experiences, which I found quite interesting to hear. This is an old bank. As you can see, some of the cottages are very pretty places. So I'll stop there with images. That's what Chernobyl looks like, a very selected view, and switch off. And play some sounds. This is a recording from the hotspot, and actually the one that Frederick mentioned earlier. That's strange. Oh dear. I can't get any sound. It's weird because it was working fine earlier. Maybe it's because the mic is on. That's a shame. Sorry, I thought earlier we got it so that we didn't have any image while it was playing, but that seems now to be not possible. It's really a problem. just in case this works. Yeah,
There we go.
better. So sorry to be a little bit distracting during that recording, but I hope you were listening to it. Can you tell me what you heard? Doesn't matter if you don't recognise the sound, but what?
I heard chirping, and then I heard you counting down.
And anything else? Did anybody hear anything else?
Kind of wind or waves.
Waves.
Right. The chirping or bleeping was the sound of the radiometer. Again, I ask you, can you actually hear me if I'm not standing there in front of the mic? Is my voice okay?
Yeah.
That's fine, yeah.
It's kind of more friendly this way. Yeah, the bleeping, chirping was the sound of the radiometer. Its intensity changes with the amount of radiation. And my voice was reading the number on the screen, which started in that recording at 600 and went up to 1,000. I said earlier that the normal was 20, so 1,000 is rather a lot more than normal, and at 1,000 I decided to turn around and come back again. But the wind, and it is wind, is also an important part of that recording. It gives you a kind of sense of atmosphere which you don't get from the images, I think, or you don't get from the image of the mounds. This is the same place as those mounds. And it's also important in the story, because I've been saying that the radioactivity is now back to normal, it's died down, it's no longer there. But the obvious question is, well, where's it gone? What's happened to it? And that question needs to be answered, for sure. Well, some of it's gone into the soil, so it has sunk into the soil. But quite a lot of it has just blown away. It goes into the soil, and if the soil is dry and it's windy, it just goes into the wind and blows away, and covers the globe in the process. So a lot of it initially blew around Europe. That's not the only way of dispersing, but it's one of them. And you can hear one of the mechanisms in that recording, something you don't get from images. You would get that from a text. Science would explain it. A journalist might relate it. But you can hear it there. And in fact, it's a very windy place. Almost all the recordings I made have some wind sound in them. So you do get a bit of information extra from images by listening, or rather if you start asking questions. And I now call this process sonic journalism. That started as a term for just being the sound equivalent of photojournalism, which is a very a much used term. It was just the audio equivalent of that. But there's a slightly more to it, because I think if you ask questions about the sounds you hear, then also you begin to find out more than you might through images or text. I'll explain that as I go on. In fact, that's what happened with this recording. This is the first recording I ever made inside the exclusion zone. What are you hearing in that? What?
Sounds like something's giving mic interference.
It does indeed, yeah. What else is there?
Birds.
Birds. There's one bird, yeah. In fact, it's electrical crackle, as you imply. And it's the sound of the pylons. As you probably heard at some point, on a wet day, pylons crackle if you happen to be close to them. Sometimes they just crackle all the time, and that's what was happening here. But whatever the weather, it implies that electricity is flowing. Otherwise you wouldn't hear that sound. And that was a surprise to me, because I had heard that the nuclear reactors inside Chernobyl had all been closed down. They were no longer producing electricity. So the question then is, well, why is there electricity flowing through these pylons? They were there to take the electricity generated at Chernobyl out and to be used for the rest of the country. But I knew that the generation had stopped, but there was still electricity flowing. So again, I asked the question later, why? And the answer is that, of course, it's obvious in a way, if Chernobyl is no longer producing its own electricity, it needs to get electricity for the people that are still there and for all the clean-up operations which are still going on. It has to get it from somewhere else. So this was the sound of electricity flowing into Chernobyl, generated from other power stations in the Ukraine. And it's a sound about the not economics in a way. It's a sound of the rest of Ukraine's power system having to be diverted into Chernobyl, and they need lots of electricity for what they do there, to continue the clean-up operation. It's kind of a sound of the drain, economic drain on Ukraine, that the exclusion zone still is responsible for. And again, hearing that sound led me to ask questions about it. I found out about the economics, or I started to find out about the economics of the clean-up operation by hearing that sound, otherwise it may not have occurred to me. So that's an example of listening and using questions that come into one's head on hearing the sounds for trying to get more information. That's why I in the end called it sonic journalism. It's that these sounds are triggers for further questions. But they're not all like that. Some were more artistic. But before I get to that, there's one more I'd like to play. What did you hear in that?
Something being pulled, stuff on the floor that somebody was walking on.
Anybody else like to?
The bird was still there.
Yeah. A bird was still there, indeed it was. Anything else? There's actually some wind in that one too. But the main sound is footsteps. But walking on what?
rubble.
Is it a road? Is it a...
No, it's an abandoned room, it's an
Right.
empty room.
You hear that it's inside.
Mhm.
You can hear, I mean, you may not know why, but the implication of that recording is inside, because actually there's some reverberation, kind of echo to the sounds. Also, it's the sound of the derelict kindergarten that you saw photographs of, and from the photographs you'll remember that there's lots of stuff on the floor, just bits of flaked plaster, pieces of glass which have been blown out and smashed. You can't put your foot down when there isn't some kind of grit, and that's the sound of walking over a wide variety of different kind of grit. It's a very characteristic sound of walking in derelict buildings, wherever, not just in Chernobyl. Wherever there's a derelict building, if you walk in it, you have a recording very similar to that. Let's carry on with the same recording. That's the radiometer again, and the bird is a cuckoo, it's a European cuckoo, and the recording there moved from the kindergarten out into the playground where the Ferris wheel is. So that the cuckoo and the radiometer are the sound of the place, that photograph of the Ferris wheel. It's more open. The radiometer reading there was 250, so again it's way above normal, but not as high as the hotspots. I like that recording too, because the cuckoo is a bird which evicts other chicks and eggs from other birds' nests in order to lay its eggs in their nests. And the parents of the other species bring up the cuckoo's chick. So both those sounds, the radiation sound and the cuckoo, are to do with eviction, albeit in very different ways. But I like the link. And it also is the case that in Ukrainian folklore, in fact in a lot of Eastern European folklore, the number of times the cuckoo repeats is a count of the years of your life, which also makes quite a nice link with the issues at Chernobyl. So I quite like that recording. One further one from the kindergarten is this. That was the derelict piano from the photograph. The keyboard's no longer there, but some of the strings, even after 20 years, are still stretched across the sounding board, and I was just running my thumb up and down the strings. Some of them are snapped and loose, and that was the more grating sound that you heard. So that was me playing the piano in one of the ways that it's still possible to do so. That particular piano you saw in the photograph. Those are the kinds of sounds you'd expect from the photographs. They're the sounds of abandonment, dereliction. But what surprised me more, in fact, were the sounds that I didn't expect. And I'll just play a few of those. That's the bar you saw a photograph of. On a Friday night, normally Friday nights are busy nights. That doesn't sound particularly busy. It's not full of people chatting, drinking. That's because in Chernobyl, Friday night is not a busy night. It's people, the workers there leave Chernobyl for the weekends. They're not allowed to bring their families there. They all have homes elsewhere in the Ukraine. So they go and work for a week and then leave for the weekends. So in contrast to most other places, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights in bars are the quiet nights, in the reverse of the norm. But that's because it's Chernobyl and the culture there. And also that's a peculiar recording because the song, or the tape, it was actually a CD, was jumping with a very bad quality CD player, which they assured me was Russian. And the barman every now and again had to give it a slap to move it on. It's just part of the atmosphere. If, when you finished your drink, you step outside the bar, this is what you hear. Those are nightingales. Actually, they're thrush nightingales. Europe has two types of nightingales, and in Eastern Europe they're called thrush nightingales. In Western Europe they're nightingales. These are Eastern European ones, thrush nightingales. They're different, but have a lot of similarities. Anyway, Chernobyl is full of nightingales. It's very, very loud. These are loud birds. They sing for hours on end without a break. It's really spectacular to hear them. But this is Chernobyl town. And these birds are singing in the abandoned gardens of the houses that are no longer lived in. And there are many of them. And if you stay up all night and wait till the following morning, this is what you hear in the same place. That's the dawn chorus in Chernobyl exclusion zone. As you can hear, it's very lively. It's a species-rich recording. I haven't played all of it, but I recorded for at least half an hour. And there are many species of birds in there. Cuckoos, the nightingales are still going, even though it's daytime, and many others as well. That's a sound which tells you that bird life, at least, is doing pretty well in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And it's often said that now Chernobyl exclusion zone is one of Europe's top wildlife sites, despite any radiation. I think the main reason for that has nothing to do with radiation. It has to do with the fact that there are no people there. And it just shows you what nature will do if you leave it alone to do it, which is a nice lesson, actually. There is an increasing amount of controversy among scientists about what effect low-level radiation has on the wildlife. Most of the research was done on the effect on humans, but there is now more being done on wildlife, and there is, as far as I can find out, not a huge amount of agreement on it. Small animals, insects, can be quite badly affected by radiation for a while, but then most of these effects, the mutations that occur, are fatal and they don't survive. So the normal starts reasserting itself. What effect it has on birds is unclear. Some research says that, for example, in the hotspots, the radiation seems to have affected females more than males, with the result that there are now more males around than females, and but on the other hand, the sperm count in the males is sometimes 0. So even though they may mate, there may be no reproduction going on. But that's disputed. There's nothing like agreement among scientists on that. if you rely on your ears, what you hear is a fantastic dawn chorus and the fact that there is much wildlife there. So it may be that in certain parts of it, the hotspot areas, wildlife gets affected, but my experience was that in those areas which are not the hotspots, it's doing very well, and such recordings are evidence of that. In fact, it was a very rural area anyway, and I asked people who lived there and are still there whether they'd noticed much change in the wildlife, and often the villagers said they hadn't. But these recordings were done in the town, where I'm sure there wouldn't have been the variety or the numbers while the people were living there. So the birds in this instance have, I'm sure, come back to repopulate the areas that the humans occupied. And it's also known that species that haven't been seen there for 100 years are now back, such as brown bears and fishing eagles, black storks, birds and animals like that have returned to the Chernobyl area since it was evacuated. One other recording which surprised me is this.
No. No.
Здравствуйте.
No, should be.
Лучше всі.
No.
That was in a village, one of the traditional villages there, where people have returned to live, and their transport is horse and cart. There's no cars. It's like going back 30, 50 years in terms of the way people live there. They have 1 cow, 2 cows, grow potatoes, either walk or use horses for transport. It's a very, very rural, traditional lifestyle still going on there. That's the sound of it. Other aspects of the same way of life are things like this. certainly wasn't expecting to be able to record that in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And it turns out that Palacia, that's the name of the region where Chernobyl is situated, is still a major folklore area. And the older people, or the older village people, still know all the old songs and they still sing them. And it's famous for their harmony singing, as you can hear in those examples. I recorded quite a few songs, maybe 15 or so from different villages, and that's just 2 of them. And it's entertainment. People do have TVs now, but they still sing the old stuff, and they still know a lot of the old folklore, the tales and the ceremonies and the festivals, which were part of the rural life there, still quite important to them. And these recordings kind of are examples of that. And that again was an example of, because I have friends in the ethnographic departments of Kiev University. They knew I was interested in sound, and so they arranged for me to, this was in the second trip, they actually took me around because they had been studying the folklore of that region for a long time, and they knew the villagers and people knew them, and they were able to get into the excluded zone without permission. They just walked over it and nobody minded. So they took me and my friends, my Russian-speaking friend, with them on this occasion. And you take food and have a party essentially, and not long after the vodka goes down, the singing starts. This is the technique, the methodology, if you like to call it such. And so those recordings were made, but I think I would never have known about them had I not told people I was interested in what the sounds are in these areas, and they kind of took that on board and were extremely helpful and made it possible for me to hear that and many other things too, and make recordings of them. And that came through being upfront about me being interested in what goes through the ear as much as any other thing. I think it opened doors that wouldn't have done for a photographer or something like that necessarily. I mean, it may, but who knows. But it certainly did in my case. And I play the last recording, which is actually the biggest surprise of the lot.
Вийду я з хати, стану на порозі, подивлюся навкруги, заливають сльози. Соловейки щебечуть в зеленому лузі, а зозульки кують і питають, а чого це ви, люди, нас покидають? А лелека кружляє круг розкиданої хати, кружляє і питає, а де ж вас, люди, шукати? Не шукайте, не найдете, він нас ніколи. Роз'їхались, розійшлись, як весняна повінь. А за що ти, Боже, нас так сильно караєш? Що з родного краю в чужі відправляєш? У родному ж краї, куди ж гляну, знаю, куди ж подивлюсь, там і покормлюсь. У лісі родному ягода червона, гриб і сіроєшка, це ж наша корнієшка. А в чужому краї сонце не там сходить. На нас, переселенців, смуток наводить. Що нам казати? Що нам робити? У кого питати? І чого нам ждати?
That's a poem, and the speaker is a woman. Her name is Svetlana Tsalko. At the time of that recording, she was 70, and she was one of the Samazels in Ukrainian. They're called Samazels. Those are the people who were evacuated and then returned. And she returned to her home village. And it turned out that she was the person that the whole village looked towards. She, in her head, kept many songs, many stories. She was a kind of memory of all the folklore, of all the ceremonies, festivals, the details of how to carry them out. She kept all this information in her head. And the other villagers looked to her for information when they wanted to carry out one of these festivals, for example. She also knew dances and songs and stories. But the effect upon her of being forcibly evacuated and removed from her home village, in fact her home culture, and where her ancestors had lived for centuries, her lineage goes back a very long time. It had a really traumatic effect on her as a person. And in fact, it triggered her to start writing poetry for the first time in her life. So, I guess 2006, 20 years earlier, she would have been 50. Soon after that, she started composing poetry in her head. She actually doesn't write it down, she just makes it up in her head and speaks it. So the only way you can find out about this is by hearing it. And my friends, the folklorists I mentioned, they had an hour-long conversation with her. This is somebody they'd known for a long time and knew quite well. But they had a conversation with her about village life, about the ceremonies, about the relationship with nature, about the turn of the seasons, all from the point of view of the people who have been living in that region for hundreds of years. And I was lucky enough to record the whole conversation. It was about an hour, and during that time she spoke 7 of her poems. That was one of them. It would be good to have a translation, so let me just find that. If I switch the image back on, that's Svetlana. That's her house, or that's the remains of her house. She no longer lives in that particular one. And these are shots of the villages. I'm trying to find translation. In the wrong way, of course. It's a shame. And I had this set up. Wrong. This. What I have done with all the information, the photographs and the recordings, is to make a double CD and book, and what you see now is the book. And here's, pardon? The book is called Sounds from Dangerous Places, and this is the poem. Okay, I'll read it. It's called People, Where Should I Look For You? I would walk out of my house and stand on the threshold, looking around me, and the tears would start. Nightingales are singing in the green fields. The cuckoos are calling, calling and asking, "Why are you leaving us?" The crane is circling above the ruined house, circling and asking, "People, where should I look for you?" Don't look. You won't ever find us. All driven away like water that disappears from the field. Oh God, why do you punish us so, sending us away from our homeland to a foreign country? Here at home, I know every place I see. Wherever I look, I find nourishment. In my native woods, there are red berries. Bread and mushrooms are food for us. But in a foreign land, the sun comes up in a different sky and brings to us settlers such sadness. What are we to say? What are we to do? Who should we ask? What should we expect? That's the poem you just heard. And as you can tell, it speaks of the sadness of being exiled from your homeland, as she puts it. And also of the relationship that she and the others have with nature around them. It's a very kind of integrated two-way type of relationship. It's where the birds and the plants are as dependent upon the people as the people are on them. And so it's not just a sadness for the people to be evacuated and sent away, it's a sadness and something incomprehensible to the nature that remains, that the people have gone. And that's quite a different relationship with nature that we have, even if we may be pretty green in our politics. Our relationship with nature is not that integrated. We don't think about it in those kind of personal terms anymore, but they do there. And consequently, they have an intimate knowledge of the seasons, all the details of living in such a place and having to live off the land to quite a large extent. Another of her poems is about trees talking to each other. The trees ask each other what I've borne all my fruit. Where are the people to pick it and to enjoy it? Why have I put all this effort in and there's nobody there to appreciate the fruit that I've produced? And the trees are sad because of the relationship has been broken, not just the people. So maybe I should start to stop now, but those are some of the examples from Chernobyl which came because I was kind of listening, or I told people that I was listening. There are things there which I think give you another layer of information about such a place, which goes on top of the images and on top of the text, or what I've spoken, or what one might read about it. It seems to me that sound has things to offer which are unique to sound. There's a sense of atmosphere, there's a sense of timing of things.